Welcome back to the pod. This is Not Without Right, Shakespeare in the Public Domain podcast. And as ever, I'm your host, Dawn Monique Williams. Today, I'm joined by theater maker, director, scholar, dramaturg, educator, uh, Karina Gutiérrez. Welcome to the show, Karina.
Thank you so much for having me, Dawn.
I'm so excited to have you on the show. This weekend, you and I are joining a cohort of other theater makers, educators, dramaturgs, directors, um, to work with Dr. Louis Douthit on her play on charting process that she's sort of trademarked in her own way. Um, and you've had the opportunity to direct a play on production.
Yeah, about a year ago at Magic Theater, absolutely. Yeah.
So I just, I wanted to jump on the opportunity to chat with you about Shakespeare and play on and adaptation and. So I'm sure we'll get to all of that. Uh, First, why don't we just run it all the way back to your days as little Karincita?
I love it.
Um, and just tell me a little bit about how you were introduced to Shakespeare, if you have an early memory or when you first heard Shakespeare.
Yeah, it's interesting because I grew up in the Central Valley. I grew up in this small city called Arvin, California. It's the last town you'll hit if you're going south towards the Grapevine, essentially. And so there's not a lot of opportunities to get into theater, let alone Shakespeare. But my first kind of experiences with performance were really the work of like the golden cinema of like movies of cinema in Mexico, right? And specifically Cantinflas, who's like our Mexican Charlie Chaplin, and then the comedic genius of this person named Chespirito, which literally translates to Little Shakespeare because he was a prolific comedic writer. So the term itself kind of comes into my lexicon way before I even get to learn about Shakespeare proper. But I grew up looking at musicals. I thought I was going to go off and be the next Sutton Foster. That did not happen. I'm very proud of where I am, but totally didn't happen. And then the work of El Teatro Campesino. Which is a farm workers theater, which was kind of like the right arm of the United Farm Workers um, union in the Central Valley and throughout California and the Southwest. So that's what sparked my interest. I had an incredible teacher who came to Arvin High my sophomore year named Sheila McClure, who was a total Shakespeare buff. And for us, English was our second language. So getting acquainted with Shakespeare felt like learning a third language. It felt like trying to figure out a mathematical equation. Here you have a bunch of Mexicanitos trying to figure out iambic pentameter. That was the whole thing. But she was just kind of this incredible figure in our lives that said, not only will you do this well, I've gone to the Shakespeare Festival and I've never placed lower than fifth, and you will do this. And we were very scared. And we had competed. I had kind of a love-hate relationship with Shakespeare because she gave us a love for language and really did a great job of trying to show us how the lyricism, the poetry is very similar to what we recognize as like Spanish Golden Age or that type of prose. And so we learned to fall in love with it. And she took us to the Southern Utah Shakespeare Festival in Cedar City, Utah. Many of us had never left the Central Valley, and she took us when we were maybe 16, 17. It was a different world. And because we're from a Title I school and an impacted school, we were placed in the Oxfordian division, which is like these hoity-toity schools. And little did they know, like that is not a marker of ability or even economics. So here we are competing against 85 different schools, and we place fifth. And it was a huge deal for us. We did the rude mechanical scene from Midsummer Nights. I played Phyllis Straight, and I still remember my opus line. No wonder, my lord, one lion may when many asses do. And we loved it. We loved it. And then we came to Bakersfield, which is a world of difference. and we went to what was ultimately a high school Shakespeare festival. And we're getting ready to go on stage. And the reason I took such a hiatus from Shakespeare was we had an administrator from the Kern High School district turn to our teacher and, who had come from a pretty affluent high school to come take the job at Arvin High, who said, I don't know why you took that job at Arvin. Those brown-faced kids can't even spell Shakespeare, let alone act it. And it really changed my world. I didn't have the words or the experience to realize that something different was taking place. It wasn't that we can't partake. There's an institution that we're rubbing up against, an institution that gatekeeps. Um, and it actually took me away from Shakespeare for many, many years as a result, because it was as if someone was saying, that's not your word. Your body doesn't mesh well with this language, even though we had fallen in love with the language. We just felt like, well, we've placed fifth at the Southern Utah Shakespeare Festival. We've reached a plateau. So it was really heartbreaking. And it wasn't until years later, in college, in an English class, that I started to rediscover that love yet again. And it's so interesting the way it works out, because I never thought I'd ever get the opportunity to direct Shakespeare or do any type of dramaturgical work. And it's Louise' vision that has allowed me to feel like, okay, I can come and play. And she invited me to do some dramaturgical work for Richard II, and ultimately I was then invited to direct it. And it scared me to no end. Can we curse on this show?
Yes.
So, okay, I'm like, it scared me shitless. I was like, who are you asking to direct? I do new work development, and you're asking me to direct Shakespeare, and not just any Shakespeare, history. And she goes, yeah, yes, I am. And so we had some incredible conversations, and I feel like I have a renewed joy. And since then, I've been able to work on a few other play on projects that are kind of in the mix. And I'm glad. I'm glad that I can now come back to it and unequivocally say, yes, I will do something mean with this, and hopefully provide another opportunity or another way of re-envisioning the possibilities of Shakespeare. Long-winded way of saying I have come back, and I'm very proud of it.
No, I love that. I, was introduced to Shakespeare only through English classes in high school, and so it was dreadfully boring. There was nothing about it that interested me or excited me. And in fact, the little militant Dawn was like, what does this dead white guy from 400 years ago, like, what does that have anything to do with me? I was so uninterested in
Mhm.
Shakespeare until much later, where I got to perform it. And so it's interesting that the reverse is what happened to you, that you were introduced to it as performance text. You did get to taste the words. You did have some positive experiences. And then somebody's like sort of bias like took that away from you, and then kept you separate from the work for so long. um I don't love that part of it. You are um a Chicano theater expert, though. So that time away from Shakespeare was used quite well. Where did you go to undergrad? When did you shift from wanting to be the Mexican American Sutton Foster to becoming a director, being all scholarly like? What was that journey?
Oh boy. So I graduated from high school. I attended UC San Diego, and I actually started as a biochem major. I was the first in my family to attend a UC. And so, and my parents were like, if you come, you got a full ride to Cal State Bakersfield. If you stay in Bakersfield, we'll buy you a car. You'll never pay rent. But if you leave home, you're on your own. And I now see this as fear. I mean, it's the typical, in many ways, of a very common story among first gen students. It's out of fear. It's nothing more than fear. And you also come from a very tight-knit community where good little Mexican Catholic girls don't leave home unless they're getting married. And my dad's like, what is this world of higher education, and what does it mean for you to be away for so long? And this looks expensive. And I graduated at the height of the first like the recession, the '08 recession. So it was getting a little dicey. But I left and was a biochem major, and I loved biology. I hated organic chemistry, and I realized very quickly I've made a horrible mistake. But I was hanging out in the theater department, and I met this incredible human by the name of Dr. Jorge Huerta. And Dr. Jorge Huerta is like the grandfather of Chicano theater. Like, he wrote the first book when people were calling this niche and saying, why don't you do Spanish Golden Age instead? And he said, no, this is worthy of academic inquiry. And he wrote the first few books. He worked side by side with Luis Valdez, and he was the first Latino professor I'd ever met in my life at that point. I'd not met a professor of color. I've maybe met 3 professors of color, and this was the first Latino scholar. And I remember almost like in a moment of self-sabotage, because it is hard. It is hard to be away from family and to be the only one from your region in this area. I knocked on many doors. And I remember those that said, come back when you have a project. I do remember them, but I also very fondly recall the people that said, I know you don't have a project, but let's see where we can fit you in. And that meant the world. And Jorge was one of those people that I knocked on his office door, and he was like, hello, what do you want to do? Oh, and I blurted out, I want to do what you do, because I had read Zoot Suit, and he wrote the introduction to Zoot Suit. And I was holding this book that I had had since I was 17, and said, this is you, like a child. It's so comical now. But I was like, this is you. I want to do what you do. And what I really meant was, I want to be able to do what you do unapologetically. He was a director. He was a dramaturg. He was a scholar. He was working in Latino theater and was constantly talking about its intersections with American performance and why it's not niche and why we as people are not niche. And it meant the world. I just wanted to be like this person. And I spoke to him last week. I still speak to the man. He's like a grandfather figure and one of my biggest influences. And he basically said, okay, I need you to know. And actually, he's part of the reason why I came back to Shakespeare and the classics. He goes, you can't just learn this tract. It is a disservice to you and your education. You need to learn the classics. You need to learn the classics so that you can then turn around and tell people, yeah, well, my communities, my indigenous communities, what have you, have also done something similar and are also worthy of praise and inquiry. Great. You have prose, we have prose. You have storytelling, we have storytelling. We have 6,000 years of Chicano, if you want to consider it uh, Latine, Chicane storytelling. You just don't acknowledge it, or it's not as easily legible to you. So, mija, you have to go back and learn the classics so that you can better understand your work, which is why I took everything from Greek to Renaissance, African American performance, musical theater. I took some dance classes. I'm like, I move with style. I try really hard. I'm not a dancer at all. And he really inspired me to just do the work. And he guided me every step of the way. I'd come in with a C plus on a paper, and he'd say, well, do you know what you did wrong? And oftentimes, again, English is not my first language. I was like, no, actually, I don't. I don't know what I don't know. And he goes, well, let's learn this together. And he sent me home with books. And in many ways, that's, if I could be half the professor that he was to me, I will have truly done my job, because I can very honestly say that I'm here because of people like Jorge Huerta. So my experience at UC San Diego was, okay, so you want to be an actor? Here's what it takes. So I started my own theater company, a la Teatro Campesino, like guerrilla theater called Toma Teatro. And this was, of course, during the Bush years when we thought it can't possibly get worse than this. How wrong was I? And so we put on, like, we'd get $400, $500, and I'd Robin Hood some lights from the La Jolla Playhouse, and we'd put on shows at like the 99 seat studio theater, formerly like Albraith 157. And that's what we would do. And then I thought, well, I'm going to go be an actor, but I don't think I want to do musicals anymore. I think I feel like I need to I need to look at this line of work. I need to look at Latine performance. And I moved to Oakland essentially after graduation because I'd gotten a job at this organization that is since no longer. It was Kaiser Permanente's educational theater programs. I worked there for about 3.5 years. I was in a show called Nightmare on Puberty Street. That's my high, believe it or not. And it brought me to the Bay, and I kept auditioning, and I kept auditioning, and I kept calling back for with updates to Jorge and my drama teacher Sheila, who was like, "Well, how's it going?" Working actor, and it got to the point where I felt like I'd reached kind of a plateau, and it kind of came at a head when I auditioned for a show at a theater company that shall remain nameless with individuals that are still very much working in the field who, when I came up to give them my headshot and resume, looked at it and said, "Oh, that's funny. You don't look Mexican."
Ooh.
Again, it's that same confrontation. It keeps coming every 10 years just to keep me honest, I think. And I responded with, "Well, why is that funny? And what does a Mexican look like?" Which was a total record scratch. Needless to say, I did not get the role, but I stopped auditioning because I just felt like I've reached a plateau. And through conversations, like that's not your only training. So who's in control of telling the story? Is it the artistic director? Is it the director? How do we get to produce a story? And I realized, oh, okay, so I need to hone those skills. And so I started applying to graduate programs. And that's how I landed at Stanford to work with Dr. Harry Elam Jr., who is a gem among gems, one of the leading scholars on August Wilson, also did the first cross-cultural comparison between, the work of El Teatro Campesino and the family, Amiri Baraka's work in the East Coast, a book called Taking It to the Streets, which is still kind of one of those cornerstone texts. And I remember sitting there at the interview process, which read kind of like the Hunger Games, because unlike other institutions, you've not solidified your spot in the program. They're still interviewing you for like 4 spots, and there's 9 of you. So you're staring around this like banquet, and everyone's your competition. And I remember talking about my experiences with Jorge and why that mattered. And it just goes to show you how small the world is, because I remember Harry saying, "Let me tell you something about Jorge Huerta. When I was graduating UC Berkeley and wanted to publish my dissertation, which was Taking It to the Streets, no one took me seriously because they said, 'Who is this Black man who's commenting on the work of Latine artists?' And he was the only one who said, 'Send me your manuscript. I'd like to read it,' and gave
Mm.
me notes. And I was like, so this is serendipitous. And
Yes, look at the full circle moment. Well, part of a full circle moment, because you now you now teach at Harry's alma mater.
I pinch myself all the time. And he really is one of the kindest and most brilliant individuals I've ever studied
Yes.
with. And again,
Harry went to Berkeley with my undergrad mentor, the first person who ever in my lifetime told me that I could go to grad school, that I had the intellect to write a dissertation. And she and Harry were classmates at Cal.
who was your mentor?
Dr. Rhoda Kaufman, she then taught for 30 years at Cal State Hayward / East Bay, and only recently retired in the last couple of years since the pandemic moved everything online. She said that's not how she wanted to be teaching anymore.
These are the people that you need to like clad in bubble wrap, because the academy isn't always as kind, but then you meet these people and it's a breath of fresh air, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, well,
So
I love that you and Harry had Jorge in common as a sort of like figure, a sort of mentor, and then Harry became your mentor, and now you're teaching at Harry's alma mater, and I do love that. I love that so much.
awesome. And they were both directors. And so now I'm here because they were both directors, dramaturg, scholars. And now we're here because you're in the mix. I mean, I see the work you're doing and I go, yes, I need to go and be in the school of Dawn Monique Williams. Yeah.
Well, thank you. That's very, very kind. Um, I do want to, maybe I have a motive, but I would love for you to talk a little bit about the Rasquache aesthetic. The first time I was introduced to that term, I was like, say more. And then I was like, oh, like poor theater. But I know that it has like sort of deeper meaning and connotation. And so I'd love if you would just unpack what that is for my viewers slash listeners. Um, because I have a whole theory that Shakespeare is Rasquache.
You know what? You were not wrong. And yes, yes, and yes, because I actually utilized a lot of this in my production of Richard II. I'm like, yeah, of course it's Rasquache. What are you talking about? But Rasquache, I mean, it's mentioned in an article by Vasconcelos called La Raza Cósmica in the 1920s, I want to say. And it really usually refers to a genre or something that is affiliated with the downtrodden, the underdog. It's shabby chic. But more than anything, it really displays a resiliency to create in times of real of real dearth. And so the way it appears as an aesthetic is that you have these household objects, these everyday objects that create a greater whole, and it's really determined on how you interact or engage with them. The term rascuache came out of necessity in order to create, and it's popularized along like these carpas or tent shows along the 1930s along the borders. So think of like a vaudevillian show that travels of sorts. That was rascuache. There was very little money, but they were highly politicized. It was a whole slew of different forms of performances that included acrobatics, dance, poetry, music, political theater. And you kind of, by existing in this kind of liminal borderland space, you kind of got away with critiquing anybody you wanted to, but it also meant you weren't getting a heck of a lot of funding. One of the more popular folks to come out of the Scarpa tent show aesthetic is Mario Moreno Cantinflas.
Mm,
So that's where he gets his training is in these vaudevillian carpa tent shows. But it could mean anything. Like rascuache is a pallet that's used to stack up boxes of grapes, can be unmoored from its purpose. And when you put people upon that pallet, it's now a stage or a tarima for dance. It's, taking a metal bowl, flipping it on its side, putting it on your head, and now you're engaged, you're in war battle. It's how you energize that object that makes it so. And I thought it's like scarcity meets Harold and the Purple Crayon in the most beautiful politicized way. You have in like the world of Teatro Campesino, you have like these curtains, and one of their more famous called La Carpa de los Rascuache. They have their whole kind of curtain made out of potato sacks. So they're repurposing things as a form of resilient, creative, you know, art making. And I thought that was so beautiful. And I'm like, it comes back down to the fact that all you need is bodies and people and storytellers to tell a good story, to produce a good play. And I feel like it absolutely connects with Shakespeare to the point that when I was asked to direct Richard II, and they said, by the way, you only have 7 actors, I went, oh, this makes perfect sense. We're going to play multiple characters. There's going to be an item that energizes them as a different character. We're going to use every last vestige, nook, and cranny of that staircase of a set to ensure that depending on how we manipulate the architecture, we're in so many different places and traveling and moving. And that makes sense to me, not just out of the scarcity model, but because it's not about, I'd love to have a huge budget for everything I do, but it's not about the budget. It's how you use what you have that lends you a good story. So I
yeah.
fully agree with you.
Yeah, I mean that's when we think, we get into these debates now about like traditional Shakespeare, non-traditional Shakespeare. Um, but traditional Shakespeare was like actors and the words,
Yeah.
right? It's a very Victorian thing, this idea that now we somehow have to like recapture historicity and that the costumes have to be these grand Elizabethan garments. Like they literally wore like the hand-me-downs. Like they just wore clothes. Like they wore contemporary clothes. They like, let's drag on these stools. Like it really was like what is available to us at our disposal to
Mm.
use. And I mean, and it's written in the words, right? Like, oh, for a muse of fire, right? Like, imagine that you are at the field of Agincourt. Like,
Yeah.
so I mean, it's like Shakespeare is very threadbare, and it's now we have technology to help support us in ways that's sometimes very, very, very fun, but it's not the imperative, you
I agree.
know? Shakespeare really is human scale. Like the imperative really is like the actor and the text.
I agree. I sometimes feel like some of these elements stand in the way of me understanding and getting close to the actor laboring on stage.
Yes.
And sometimes I feel like it also creates a world that never was, because part of the institutionalization of Shakespeare, or what ultimately led me to take a hiatus, is this idea that it was only Shakespeare, or it was only high art if it had XYZ, or it portrayed XYZ. That included my brown body, light-skinned, but even so, still reading as other brown. And the world of Shakespeare, and even the subject matter that we find in each one of his plays, um, is anything but. It's very much in Technicolor, and it was always meant to be. And I think it's a disservice that as it's been institutionalized or academicized, that has fallen from the wayside. I think it stands in the way, and I think it actually is a deterrent for many people. And I think if we were just honest about what you've just said, it'd be so much more accessible, interesting, and inviting. My two.
Yeah. My 2 cents. So together we've got 4 cents. We're
I
just
love
shy of
it.
a nickel. um, Great. So let's dive a little bit deeper then on your relationship to Play On. You said Louis called you up and said, "Hey, you want to do a little dramaturgical work on this Richard?" So where was Naomi at in that process? Um, I believe that she was working with Joy Meads on that
Yeah.
translation. I'll put it in air quotes. So yeah, what was the state of things when you were brought in?
Well, it's interesting because by the time I came in to direct, well, first, I should say that Magic had this idea of producing something in rep. And they knew that they wanted to do one of Naomi's newer works, which she had been working on for like some 20 years, Garuda's Wing. And they thought, well, what is another show that we can do in rep? And it just so happens that she'd been invited years prior to write a translation of Richard II, and as you mentioned, had been working with Joy Mead. And so it was already published. All 130 pages of her Richard II had already been published through Play On. The Garuda's Wing had yet to be finished. And so part of the original dramaturgy was getting people in a room, talking about some of the new pages that she had produced for Garuda's Wing, and also talking about this other published work, which, when you put side by side comparisons, which Louie and I did, she really only changed maybe 30% of the text, but that 30% was crucial because it does make it so much more accessible. I mean, she really was a surgeon, keeping prose, keeping meter, everything. It was beautifully done. Um, in addition to that, Sean San Jose had already been working on a play on show as well. Oh gosh,
He did Coriolanus.
Coriolanus, thank you. He had been working on Coriolanus and had said, it might be a great idea if we can create a Shakespeare piece that's about 90 minutes. And I went, uh-huh. And so I got Naomi's script, and they're like, so dissect this even further. And so I worked with Louis. I go, okay, so an hour 30. This show is easily, as it stands, 2 hours, 2:15. And you're asking me to hack a lot off. And people are going to be very upset because what I love about Richard II is its poetry. You have a king who is self-reflectant and speaks in prose, and it's one of the few instances that you get this, and a young artistic prince at that. And I go, if I take some of the poetry, people are going to get mad, but I'm going to have to lose the poetry in order for there to still be a story central. And even the central thesis sentence of the story may have to shift if I cut too much. So, I think it took about 9 drafts where I got it down to 59 pages. And it was not free of debate, let me tell you. But it did mean that we got straight to the battle. Like rather than having the preamble between Bolingbroke and friends, we go straight into Act One, Scene Three. We go into the battle royale. Here's our first battle at hand that leads into people being banished, which sets everything into motion, right? And so it was about not trimming fat because I wouldn't call this disposable language. I think it's really beautiful and poignant, but I think it's getting to the relationships. How do we get from one beat to another to essentially express human connection? How do we get from one beat to the next in one breath? And so that became kind of the reasoning behind certain things getting cut, certain things staying in. When do we need a breath to just take in the information we just reprieved? Well, then that moment between, the sailor saying, "Hey, let me catch you up on the battles that are happening," that stays in. It's all of half a page, but we need that breath. Became how I started to make those cuts. Um, it again, my love for the language came through. I was like, okay, but it still needs to make sense, and I need to honor what Naomi has set forth, which is as much as possible honor the meter, honor the prose, don't interrupt the language, make sure that you're making surgical cuts, but that the story still rings. And it actually gave us, I think, a story that was very necessary at that time, especially right prior to an election year, which was, do we ever have, and one that still stands, we don't have the divine right of kings here in the United States. It's a concept that's maybe a little bit more foreign for us, but we do go forth and honor an altar called capitalism. And the leading question then becomes, do we ever have the right to usurp power by force? I mean, that still stands. We're seeing that in a variety of different ways, political, social, economically. Uh, And if we could rally behind that central thesis, then the poetry still rings through. It also was a really great experiment in terms of taking them as a director and a dramaturg, using both sides of my brain and saying, what needs to be said and what in text can disappear but can be said non-verbally. That is a very delicate balance. And it was a great experience.
Yeah. Um, I sort of, thanks to the gift of a syllabus you created, last term I taught Richard II, and the students read Naomi's full published
Mhm.
version, and they watched the David Tennant RSC
Oh,
production,
yes. That's a good.
and they watched the Stratfest 2023 production. So they have these three versions to compare, and it's really fascinating because you were doing this sort of like right right in front of an election, but to come back to it and study it sort of right behind an election is also just reveals how timely these questions are. Really, this idea of divine rights of kings, these are still really timely questions. And I worked with Bill Rausch at OSF on the OSF production that happened in 2016. And I remember very vividly the actor that played Bolingbroke, every time somebody would say, "Oh, Richard is, disposed, blah blah blah, deposed," he would say, "Abdicated, abdicated." Like he would like, so like keeping
Yeah.
that tension really alive in the room, keeping that question really alive in the room. What do transitions of power look like? What is
Mhm.
deposed? What is abdicated? And of course, I know that Shakespeare was writing the whole thing as like political propaganda, right? To
Absolutely.
justify Elizabeth being a rightful person on the throne to begin with. Um, so I think, and also just coming off of, I'm not Catholic, but
Mhm.
coming off of us just watching a conclave in real time and sort of the ceremony of that and sort of the way that like religion intersects with power and thinking about a play like Richard II, where you have so much like intersection of religion, you have these like cardinals, you have, I mean, it's in the costume design. um so it really feels like an absolutely timely piece. One of the things that I most love about Play On, at least in theory, is Louis has said so many times, we're putting a dramatist back in the room.
Yeah.
So what was Naomi's relationship with your like directorial cut or directorial vision, getting the show to production? What was that?
Naomi is amazing. First, I'm also gonna plug a little bit. She is the playwriting professor at UCSD, and she came on board my final year as a student. So I got to have her in class. And so when I met her, I'm like, I know you don't remember me, but I was in your class when I was 21. And she looked at me like, I really don't remember you, but I'm glad you're here. And it's totally fair. Totally fair. She was really open. She goes, I've kind of done my part in that I have created this text that I think really opens the apertures. And she was really open to how it could be developed. So we had a couple of conversations, but a lot of the conversations I had were with Louis. And I tend to think a lot in story kind of storybooks. So I am a very visual person. So as I'm putting together kind of like my directorial vision, I tend to like draft, I tend to draw. It's very visual. And so one of the images that kept coming up that Naomi and I and Louis talked about was the megachurch, the influence of the megachurch. I'd been reading like Christian Hanath's The Christians. So it was very much present in my brain, but um it it really led me to believe, like, is there really a difference between the all-powerful pulpit and the steps of Congress? And that actually became the basis for the scenic design. It's a series of stairs where we could essentially create these hierarchical um, tableaus based on who these people are. You have such a short amount of time to learn all of these names, and they're switching all of these different characters, even so, that sometimes having that hierarchical pose told you where we stood in terms of our relation to power. It also stretched the lighting and the steps stretched into the audience, which meant that there was no passive audience. You were watching the battle royale, or you yourself were also taking testimony at the same time. And so those initial conversations are what led to the container or the visual world that we established as part of Richard II, which to me was challenging because I am a cafeteria Catholic, which means I pick and choose, and lately less and less sometimes. So it meant really also on a personal level contending with what are the last vestiges of power that are connected to religion that are present in me? What are my own biases? And how do you make that read to an audience that may be at very differing stage of their contention with religion, power, and its intersections? You know?
Yeah, I am fascinated by all of it, and love the different ways that directors have approached
Mhm.
um that intersection of like religion and power and authority and the space between like God and the cardinals and the king and so like with that David Tennant RSC version, he's very messianic. Like he's in this like long white thing and he has his scepter and his orb and he has this long like Roman Jesus hair. And like there's no mistaking like the iconography that they were going for in that production. You had an exciting group of rebels in this cast. Um, was it an entirely female cast?
No, not quite. Um, Ugi Zuleto and Juan Amador were also in the
Okay.
cast, but largely femme presenting for sure. Which again, it's like another opportunity to say it's not about gender, it's about power. What is it that Shireen Moraga says? It's not the phallus I crave, it's the power behind it.
Mm,
So you absolutely got to play with what does it mean to perform power? If you can, if you can lead others to see that performance over gender or what have you, then you're really cooking with fire. But it was seven, it was a group of seven, and Janae played our Richard the second. And it was a lot of conversation had to go around that. What does it mean to have a prince in a precarious position of power be portrayed by a Black woman? Well, what does that look like today? What are its equivalences, its false equivalences? We should talk about that. But also, I I look at someone like Richard II and I go, this is an artist that had he been born into a Renaissance, he would have been an excellent king. He was born at the wrong time. I am not as judgmental. I can't be as judgmental. Wrong time, wrong place. But had it been a time of great flourishment, then he would have been, I think, an excellent king. He would have brought us into the artistic renaissance in a way that other.
yes, he loved arts and culture and fashion.
Exactly, very much so. And so when I thought about, well, what does the costume look like? What does looks, grand, I don't know, mega church dress look like? And so I worked with Kyo, who created this excellent color palette of like the royal purple, but it's fitted in couture. Um, and it kind of gives the resonance of the kind of brocade of, the Elizabethan theater while making it still very much contemporary. And as you start shedding these articles, you actually start to see the seams. And so it felt regal, contemporary, approachable, and yet it's in literally the undoing of a king that you start to see that we are all but mere mortals. We are all
Yeah,
but flawed mortals.
yeah, yeah. Richard definitely is a character that I'm gonna argue that like if done right, teases that fine line of empathy, right? Because it's
Mhm.
very easy early on to just be like, okay, he's a spoiled brat, he's
Yeah.
making bad decisions, he's being a petulant child. But when he is alone in the cell, and he just really takes the audience in his confidence, there's something so beautiful in that recognition of like, I am a mere mortal, and there's just something so, so touching um, in that. Uh, so
And
that
it's
Shakespeare,
that's Shakespeare. And then it's like, okay, if you do the dramaturgical research, you realize Homie didn't have a chance. I mean, he wasn't raised by a father. He was raised by a series of agendas. I
yes,
mean, all of these people that wanted something out of him from a young age when he took the throne at what, 10?
yes,
Something along those lines. So when you talk about what is an allegiance to who? Did they have an allegiance to him or did they have an agenda? He was never meant to succeed, not under those circumstances. And you start to really humanize. And I think that's important with Shakespeare because I think they're viewed as these kind of remnants of these historical figures or a personification of a historical figure in a textbook, right? But I have to say, like, it really humanized what it means to be in a position of power, any type of power, whether it be king, CEO, professor in a classroom. Um, the teetering between this is what I know, this is what I've been taught, this is what my gut tells me, can I be myself? He's also a very young individual who is meant to be petulant in today's standards, who at that age isn't selfish, petulant. It makes sense. It just so happens that he's the king who hasn't
Yeah.
necessarily had someone with a moral compass leading him as such. So of course I feel a lot of empathy and also say, yeah, man, you messed up, but I can see why you messed up. And the world is a really cruel, cruel place.
What is the next Shakespeare? Either sort of you take the Shakespeare and you cut it yourself as the directors want to do, or is there a play on text? Is there somebody that's been tasked with translating one of the Shakespeares that you're like, that writer, because these translators are like living writers and it's so
Yeah.
exciting. It's like the combination of Shakespeare and that writer is like, I would love to get in that mix.
Oh my gosh, there's so much. There's so many. Like Migdalia Cruz also translated a Mackers. That's
Yes, she did.
that's pretty amazing. I have actually been working with Melinda Lopez on a version of Twelfth Night, and it
Oh,
is like different vernaculars of Spanish. And it's still very much in its earlier stages, but we've had a couple workshops at the Huntington, and it's been pretty awesome. So I've been talking to Louis about that one, and hopefully that will get on its feet. I think it's a timely one to have. Uh, so that would be a really fun one to work on. And her work is incredible because she's looking at Caribbean Spanish, Mexican Spanish, Chicano English. And how does this work in a world that we call this kind of liminal space where Latinidad is an amalgam of things, not just and but never how like a stereotype. Um, and so she's working with all of these different vernaculars to create a Nueva España or a Nuevo something that both exists in our contemporary time, but is also an offshoot of our pretty distant past. So
mm,
I'm really excited because this is now kind of an in between kind of como se dice, frames in between that which we're calling translation, which is what Playonist has to do, and a little bit of adaptation.
yes.
So that's really exciting, especially given what's happening politically. I think it's important we start to blend those.
Yes. Uh, Eric Ting and I directed Marcus Gardley's Lear at
Oh,
Cal Shakes, and it was very much like his Lear, his play on Lear was published. That was published and that was done. And this was like the next iteration where it was
right.
like, okay, I've published my play on Lear,
Mhm.
and now there are some things I want to tinker with. So it was very much leaning more toward adaptation. And I'm sure if given more productions that Marcus would get in there and like tinker some more.
Mhm.
So that is so to me when you think of like because Shakespeare is my favorite playwright, and people that watch the show know that. That's why I made the show because Shakespeare's
What?
duh. Um, but the idea for me of what it means then for me to get like a Shakespeare that is like then filtered through like Octavio Solis, through Marcus Gardley, what it means to have Migdalia do one of these. And I've heard Taylor Bailey, the now executive director of Play On, talk about like Play On 2.0. And so this idea that they're like gonna potentially go back out and do another round of
Wow.
commissions that might be more about like you're saying this more liminal space of like okay great we have the sort of the project of first do no harm
Mhm.
like we're going like meter we're keeping prose like we're really it's really is about surgical only to change where we might run into a bump in the road where we have like
Mhm.
really lost all sense or meaning of that word or application of that word to now something that's like, okay, now maybe there's a little more freedom. Maybe it's a little more about our like modern or contemporary context. Maybe there is a particular theme that you want to grow a little bit more. Maybe there is a way that you wanted to like manipulate that character that in the original like play on 1.0 was not the assignment, but
Right.
now here's like sort of like the shadow work of it kind
Shadow
of
of the
thing.
South. It's like that's Emma Perez third space. Wow, we're getting into the theory. But like it's true. How awesome would it be to have someone like um, I don't know, Rivera, known for their magical realism, do something like The Tempest? Or if we go back to the rude mechanicals, the shabby chic of it all, have someone like Inan Valdez write a new Midsummer's.
Yeah.
I mean,
I
it
mean, that's exactly like for me, that's so exciting to just like keep. Well, I mean, I know people are so precious about their Shakespeare. However, he was not precious about his sources, right? So I'm like, I think he would eat this up. I think he would be like, wait a minute, I'm that dude. Like, I am now the source text. Like, people are now taking my plays and making new plays. Like, people are now taking like my Mercutio and like reinventing the thing that I invented on top of this Romeo and Juliet hecka old story. It was not a new story, people. It wasn't new. It
no,
was an old
was it?
story. Very old story. They had Italian, French, and Spanish versions long before English plays.
Nope.
But he invented Mercutio, right? So I just think Shakespeare would just be like so flattered. I just think he'd be so geeked to be like, wait a minute, I've really made it. That like now I'm the source material that people are like inventing on top of. Um,
I agree.
and I have just there are playwrights that I just love. Marcus, Luis Alfaro, Dominique Morisseau. I mean, I know some of them
Oh,
may
Dominique
never be
Moore would.
interested in ever doing this, but I'm just like, what would it be like to just see like these new lenses just like reframe these stories?
Well, and I guess so to like Shakespeare, like any other art form, is still alive. I think we do something horrible when we calcify it as if this is you're doing Shakespeare wrong. Well, your guess is as good as mine. I mean, how many folios have we found? Some of them, the Arden. I'm doing my homework in preparation for this weekend. And Arden quotes at least 6 or 7 different variations on this particular play that they're borrowing from. The reality is to what end? It is alive. It is meant to
Yeah,
continue. It is meant to continue to shift as any good society does. And the Shakespeare should be no different. And actually, it's ability to grow and remain flexible that essentially brought me back. And I think it would bring many others back if there is enough of an aperture for us to make it our own.
that's definitely how I feel about it. I feel like I have decided that I'm going to be an ambassador for Shakespeare, not by telling people that they have to like subscribe or ingest it in a certain way, but by letting people know that it is so malleable and it can bear the weight of almost anything. That doesn't mean I'm going to like every rendition. I
Fair.
mean, like, there's going to be some stuff, and I'm going to be like, no, that just sucks. But I'm just one person with one person's opinion. So it could bear the weight of almost anything, and it'll still be okay. And
Yeah.
we could go so far away from it. And then you know what'll be cool is that then it'll be like some outlier who's like, you know what I want to do? I want to do like a historically accurate Shakespeare. And it'll be like, oh, that's novel. That's fun. What does that look like? Like let's just go through those cycles every few hundred years of like, great, we blew it up. Now what is it like if we like reconstruct it? Oh, this is what it's like. Great, let's blow it up again. Let's take the whole thing apart again. Um, I, I, I mean, that's why I made this whole podcast in the first place because
I would follow
it
you as
is
ambassador.
alive.
I mean, are there banquets? Can we attend the ambassadors' banquets?
Oh my goodness, let's. Are you planning one? Are you planning the
I mean,
first one?
listen, I'll order some Little Caesars pizza and we'll just talk Shakespeare, and that's still a good time.
That's a great time. That's like my life story right there. Little $5 hot and ready. It is not $5
It is
anymore. And usually it's not hot and ready anymore either. But it's
not.
still a pretty cheap
I'm more
pizza.
cranky about the pizza than I am about the establishment of Shakespeare any longer. That's funny. That's amazing.
Um, yeah, I just that's why I have the podcast because I think Shakespeare lives. It's alive. We interact with it in our daily lives. So for better or for worse, like how do we feel about it? What do we want to do with it? What does it still have to teach us?
Yeah.
What should we maybe just like, oh, let's put pause on that and like highlight this for a little while,
Mm.
right? Certainly don't want to be like misappropriating things like Rasquache, but to remind people that like, hey, these were all new plays when Shakespeare wrote them, and they didn't have much to do them. And remember, they couldn't even do them like across the river. Like being an actor was like you were like poor. You were like low. You were like second class citizen. So it's like we're just we're just grabbing some things and we're just no, and we're gonna do all that we can to beat the censors. Like we're gonna try and get all this crude stuff right past the censors, all this political intrigue, just slip it right in. It's a perfect time for that. Right now is a perfect time.
It's such a perfect time because we're again at a time, and I don't want to sound elitist, where we have an opportunity to truly outwit. When all we have is our wits about us, we can truly outwit. And the reason it was, not censored is because it was also really good. And I do think that in these moments of political turmoil, that the political theater is really good. And we're about to see that, I hope. I want to
Yes,
put my hat in the race there, but that
yes,
political theater is about to be incredible. We're at a time where we desperately need it. And I think Shakespeare has a place in that conversation. I really, really do. Whether it's as a as a disguise at first and it becomes the pill that cannot be regurgitated, or it has something to offer us, much like it did at the time of production of Richard II, to contemplate. um, I think there's a lot to be said. It's an exciting time. It's an exciting time for Play On. It's an exciting time to be revisiting the classics, because I still think they have a lot to offer us, in terms of learning about structures of power in the human condition. And I think it's
absolutely.
also a time where we can take those stories and say, now I'm going to put it on its side, or I'm going to do something mean to it. And I think that's great. I think that's the point.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
Yeah.
Um, well, Karina, I know that you are rushing off to your next thing with your busy, busy life. So, happy birthday again. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
spending your birthday with me. I mean, I will actually see you on your birthday.
Yay.
And I look forward to hanging out with you this weekend as we take a deeper dive into Play On.
Thank you so much, Dawn. You're amazing. And this was just an absolute blast.
Let's go.